My name is Chuck Burack, and I'm a professor and core faculty in the Consciousness and Transformative Studies program.
I'm Karen Jaenke, and I'm the chair of the Consciousness and Transformative Studies program. So Eckhart Tolle is an author. He grew up in Germany and then went to, I think, University of London. At 29, he had this spiritual awakening experience, and then subsequently became a teacher. About 10 years later, started doing teachings, and he's sold millions of books. He's very popular. I have a friend who is actually going to join us, Astrid Berg, who just did one of his trainings in Norway, where there were 800 people. And he teaches from his own life experience, his own inner experiences. He's not tied to any religious or spiritual tradition, which I think is part of what makes him interesting, because the language he uses is just very much everyday language. Not tied to a lot of, references in spiritual texts or fancy language. And so it's very accessible to ordinary people. And I think for that reason, his work has really caught on. It's something that anybody, he says, anybody could connect with and work with his ideas. And so one of his main ideas is to differentiate really two different aspects of the mind. One is the mind that is trying to solve a practical problem and is, utilized in information gathering and analyzing, et cetera. And then the other part of the mind, which is the dysfunctional part of the mind, is sort of that constant inner chatter that those inner tapes that we let run all the time. And usually those inner tapes and inner chatter is negative thinking, critical thinking, and it's thinking that separates us from other people in the world. And so he makes that distinction, and then he also makes a distinction between mind and consciousness. And he says that consciousness is basically a deeper intelligence than the mind, and that the mind arises out of consciousness, but the mind is dependent on consciousness, but consciousness is not dependent on the mind. And when you're able to quiet this chattery mind, and disidentify from that part of the mind, you drop into consciousness or being. And he believes that that is our original nature, our true nature as a human being, and that as long as we're caught in that chattery mind, which is also another word for that would be the ego or the false self, we create suffering for ourselves, because we create separation between ourselves and the world, and kind of a world of duality. But when we drop back into this deeper level of consciousness, the quiet mind, we enter into stillness and peace.
I think that Tolle's teachings are very important for our time, because we live at a time when the mind itself is emphasized, whether it's using our minds in business, using our minds in school. We're basically always caught up in our thoughts. He associates the mind with thought that's concept-based, when we're thinking in words, when we're thinking in numbers, even when we're thinking in images. So consciousness is when you let go of thought that's based on concepts. You let go of thought that's based on images. You let go of thought that's based on numbers, and you drop into a kind of observational mind, a kind of witnessing consciousness. So that's something that's not very easy for people to do, because we're encouraged to use our minds, be caught up in our thoughts, be caught up in our concepts, our images, and this idea of dropping our thoughts, dropping our images, dropping our logic, that's not very easy for a lot of us, since we're socialized, we're conditioned, we're educated to sort of be in the mind. Even our whole understanding of intelligence is about using the mind to analyze, to compare, to quantify, and so on. But he's really saying, let that go, drop into a kind of primordial awareness, a kind of pre-conceptual presence that allows us just to observe, to feel, to be present. And that really does take some effort, and also takes some training. Sometimes I think that Tolle maybe makes it look a little too simple, like it's an easy thing just to kind of drop your mind and sink into that awareness, because our minds are so filled with chatter, and We're surrounded by technology that encourages that inner chatter as well as outer chatter. And so this idea of quieting down the mind, getting into a place of stillness is very difficult to do. And that's why, for example, something like meditation or mindfulness practice or some other kind of mind cultivation practice is really necessary in order to be able to drop that kind of chattering mind.
The timeless spiritual teachings need to be retold in the language and with the struggles of the people that people live in their own time. And I think Chuck spoke to that in terms of talking about how much we're conditioned to be in our mind and our incessant thought process that takes us away from a deep presence or being. And so that's really the heart of his teaching. And in the book, he gives a lot of practices about how to do this. So it's not just a theory. And one of the first practices he offers is basically the way to get out of this chattery mind is to just start observing it. Develop a part of your consciousness that is watching the mind as it talks and noticing it. And then you've already created a separation, a beginning separation from that chattery mind. And that's the beginning of awareness or presence. And that's a doorway right there. And ultimately, the goal is that you would have that observing presence all the time, observing your emotional reactions, observing your thought processes, and that way you're not embedded in the reactive part of the self or the chattery, noisy part of the self.
You observe the chatter.
You observe the chatter.
Instead of being part of it, you are observing it.
Exactly.
Nice.
And that one step is just the critical shift, because you're already, so it's all about disidentifying from this chattery mind. And as soon as you start observing it, he says you've shifted some of your psychic energy into awareness or consciousness and out of this busy mind that keeps you embedded in the world, keeps you separate from the world, and really, he says, is the source of all suffering, or most of suffering, is when we're identified with this chatter.
And one of the things that he says about the observer or the witness that I like, that sometimes in some ways differentiates him from some other teachings, are that he doesn't emphasize being detached. In other words, you don't step back and look at things. He wants you to feel, he wants you to be connected to your body. So it's not a kind of observation from afar where you're detached and you're cut off from your feelings. You're actually present to your feelings, present to your body, and in fact, he encourages you to always have part of your awareness on your inner body, your inner sense, like what does it feel like in your gut right now, what's happening in your chest right now, as you're connecting in the outer world, to have part of your attention on the inside.